Great. Okay, well, I'm going to kick us off here. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time this evening to attend this user story mapping event hosted by BPMA and led by previous VP of Product at Carbonite, Chris Peterson. If we could get the next slide, please. A quick overview into what BPMA is as an organization. It's a Boston-based organization that's geared towards product professionals, really meant to help you with three things: help you level up your skill set, help you network with fellow practitioners, and help you land new opportunities. We can next slide here. Those three things we certainly don't do in a vacuum. We don't do alone. We have great help with sister organizations, some of those being Women in Product, Agile Project Open, Product Camp. And not only do we do those three things, but we provide a number of services as well. These are the monthly events like the one you're attending now. These are things like our blog post, our mentorship program, as well as our job board, which admittedly for the first time I posted a job today. So know that you can take advantage of the events that our sister organizations are running, as well as the services that BPMA provides. Good, next slide here. And of course, those things wouldn't be possible just alone. I have to give a big round of applause and thanks to our sponsors and partners, 280 Group, who was involved in last month's event, as well as a number of others here. They helped make this possible. So pause for a moment and big shout out to these organizations for generously partnering with and sponsoring BPMA. Moving on, we have a incredibly unique and what I think is exciting opportunity at BPMA here. We're expanding our board of directors and including a director of diversity and inclusion. And we'd love for you to either consider yourself apply for this role if this is something that's passionate for you, or forward it along to a colleague of yours that you know is passionate and mission driven about this critical area of product management in order to bring diversity of thought into what we do every day. So know that you can apply through this link here, which I encourage you to either screenshot, write down, copy and paste, etc. Can't copy and paste, but paste into a URL. Know that nominations will be due on the 9th of September, with elections being held on the 14th. So please do consider this for yourself or your network. Next month's event is going to be an exciting opportunity to talk about the relationship between product managers and product marketers. So I encourage you to hold your calendars for September 16th. You can also go to our Eventbrite or our website and register for that event right now, but that's going to equally be an awesome event. Great, and now this is the wrap of the intro slides. Thank you very much for parting with your Thursday evening on an introduction to user story mapping. I'm excited to introduce our facilitator, previous VP of product from Carbonite and current product consultant, Chris Peterson.
Thanks, Michael. Good evening, everybody. It's great to meet you. I see a couple friendly faces out in the audience. That definitely helps. Thank you all for joining tonight. I'm very excited to share this with you all. As Michael mentioned, I was at Carbonite for about 9 years, all in product management up until February of this year, and then I've kind of moved on to consulting. But this was a tool that I learned early on in my time at Carbonite, and one that I felt was a critical planning tool that I think everyone should at least be exposed to. And let's dive in and show you guys what it looks like. All right, so in terms of agenda, the goal of tonight is really about providing everyone here with some exposure. User story mapping is a technique that people teach 3-day-long immersive courses on this. We're not going to get down into that level of detail in the hour tonight. What I really want everyone to come away with is exposure to the topic, understanding of like when and how to use it, why it's beneficial, and hopefully spark some interest such that you want to go out and learn more about this and try and apply it in your day-to-day. So we're going to go through the basics of what is this, why should we use it, what problems do I think it solves in product development. Then, as Michael mentioned, we at BPMA like to push the technological boundaries. So we're going to attempt a large-scale group breakout session where you guys actually get to try this hands-on in small groups and then come back to the group. And then finally, we're going to come back together and talk through some additional resources and ways that you can get started. And then we'll move into Q&A. And I'm actually very excited for Q&A that we're going to be joined by Jeff Patton. So Jeff is a internationally recognized sort of expert on this topic. He literally wrote the book if you go look on Amazon. And he's agreed to join us for Q&A tonight to kind of help out and make sure everyone's questions get answered appropriately. So with that, we're going to keep on moving here. And I would like to say that, before we jump in on these types of things, as a product person, it's always good to sort of identify who is your target user and what problem are you solving for them before you jump into coming up with solutions. And the good news is for this particular topic, the user is everyone on the phone. It's you guys. It's PMs, it's user experience designers, it's developers. It's people trying to create products and trying to work within the sort of agile framework and the artifacts that come around this. There's going to be some presupposition here that you're doing something close to agile. There's going to be some language that's going to sound familiar. You don't have to be doing that, but you're going to see the tie-ins. And what I've seen, the problem as I've seen it is, even if you're doing all this stuff right, you can still come away with something missing, right? You can have awesome meetings with your team. Everybody gets, well, long ago when we all used to get in rooms together, or you get in Zooms together, everybody gets together, you talk, you're aligned, you know what you're doing. That gets broken down into, maybe epics and stories that go into some sort of quote flat backlog management. And what I mean by that is, whether it's Excel or Jira or whatever tool you're using, it usually looks like a flat list or a panel of a couple flat lists. Is how the work actually gets captured and how you typically look at it every day. And then, user experience goes off, comes up with high fidelity mocks, prototypes, clickable prototypes. But sometimes even with all of this, maybe 3 weeks go by between the time you did the planning and the time the team actually starts the work. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less. And suddenly when you go to start the work, maybe not everybody was all tied together to begin with. Maybe the linkages between all these things aren't clear and there's something missing. And I think user story mapping is sort of the artifact and the activity that helps tie all of these things together. And I think you guys will see that tonight. Okay, so what is it? It's two things. The most obvious, you can see from the picture there, is it's a visual planning technique used to sort of represent user workflows. So, in the olden days, like 2019, you could have done this in a room with lots of sticky notes on a board with your whole team sort of participating. But even before then, this has sort of moved into an online activity, and we'll get into some tools later in the presentation. Obviously, with remote distributed teams now, there's had to be ways to do this a little bit more online than tactile. But at its core, it's a way of lining out a user workflow so that you can see what someone's going to go through to accomplish a goal. There's a couple things here. One, you can actually use this as a way to represent current state. So before you jump in and start proposing ways to improve a user workflow, sometimes it's really helpful to try to capture visually in some way what's the user doing today. You can use this technique to do that and then start from the basis of that before you start moving things around and starting to introduce an improved workflow. So it's kind of like a great way to visualize your user research and really make it come to life in a respect. The second thing that story mapping really is this way of getting to what's called shared understanding. And everyone's felt this or seen this, but basically it's this notion that like when everybody on your team, whether it's the PM, the designer, or the developers, looks at one of the stories or one of the things you're about to do, does everybody understand what that means? Do they all understand to be the same thing? Do they understand why you're doing it? And that tends to be, you tend to have your shared understanding in the room on the day you do it maybe, but sometimes it falls away after you leave. And that's why this activity is very critical. It allows you also to plan different releases. So you'll see the sort of lines on there, and we'll get into this later, but when you have a big complex workflow, it allows you to sort of break the work into release chunks in a very sort of methodical way. That also allows you to avoid some of the common pitfalls you tend to fall into with a flat backlog system. You can't see sort of the end-to-end user workflow at the same time that you're planning the release itself. But more importantly, almost in any of these things, is it's really the activity of building the map. And we'll go through this more, but this is really the place where, the team can come together and really you can harness the creative power of the team. And I know sometimes that sounds cliche or buzzwordy, but it's really true. I've seen a common failure mode of PMs, like they want to get out ahead, so they fill in a bunch of the blanks for the team, or maybe the PM and the user experience person were kind of working off by themselves. They show up with one of these things pre-filled out. The way that you really sort of harness the creative energy of the team, get everybody aligned and make sure that they're engaged, is actually allow them to very much participate in the creation of the map itself. And then you have this cool artifact to take with you, but you also have that shared understanding and that experience everyone remembers about why a certain thing is higher priority than another thing and why we added this particular piece of work. Okay, so I'm going to walk through an example. I tried to pick something that I felt everyone could relate to in the current state. So we're going to do ordering takeout from or delivery from a mobile app. Being that this is Boston, I'm sure there's at least one person on the phone that actually does this for a living, and this is your product. I'm about to greatly oversimplify, so for that I apologize, but bear with me for the example here. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is lay down what's called the backbone, and really these are just the highest level steps that the user is going to go through, and they're almost like categories of steps. So in this particular case, you can see that there's like the broad categories are, I got to find the app, I got to do some things related to setting it up for the first time, I got to find the place I want to order from, I got to build the order, I got to pay for it, I want to know that it's actually going to show up, and then sort of a catch-all for like other stuff. Generally speaking, you lay it out left to right as the user will experience it, and you know, this is one of those conversation pieces. Like sometimes a PM will come with this already sort of like filled out, and that can be kind of a good jump start and time saver. But I would definitely say like make sure as you get into the room with your development team and your designers, that people have freedom to sort of reorder things, add and remove, and more importantly, that anytime that happens, you guys talk about why you did it. Like why are you moving something in the order? Why are you adding something that didn't used to be there? And everyone hears that conversation. Like that's really the key of this whole exercise. Like the pretty looking picture is great, but the conversation is really what drives it. And as you can see on here, generally speaking, if you're following some sort of agile method, the backbone items will translate into what are epics. And you'll see that a little bit more in a second, but just for a vocabulary piece, that's one of the tie-ins. Okay, one other thing of note, so we're not going to get into a ton of depth on this tonight, as I mentioned, but you may or may not actually have a user that will hit every single item in the backbone, and that's okay. Some very large, complex user story maps will actually have multiple personas at play, and maybe only certain personas are going to hit certain steps, and that's fine. That's obviously a little bit out of scope for the introduction we're giving tonight, but just another thing to be aware of if you have a large complicated workflow where maybe the first couple of releases are going to handle one persona and then start to address others later on. You can totally do that in one map. And it's okay if people sort of skip as they go through the backbone. Okay, so then you start to build out the actual steps, and perhaps not a shock, these things are actually what are going to become user stories eventually in the backlog. It's not super critical that you adhere to any particular type of story format. It's really about capturing the idea. Obviously, if you have multiple personas at play, you're going to want to note like this particular task or step is only related to persona A or persona B, so you have that record. But basically, once the backbone's built, you want the entire team brainstorming, right? And you can set some basic guidelines about what's inbound and what's outbounds, but this is one of those key points where if you really want the whole team engaged and you want to get the most out of what's possible in planning something like this, you want everybody at the board coming up with all their ideas. So obviously that means everyone has to know enough about what you're doing and the user to feel like that's going to be useful. So you got to do a little prep there, but getting everyone engaged, whether they're, again, PM, UX, dev, or even a great place to engage product marketing in this step too, if they're going to be closely related, get everyone coming up with stories and filling out the board. So you can add steps that fall into each category going down. And then once you kind of have it built out, you're going to start moving the higher priority stuff to the top and the lower stuff to the bottom. And again, once you have the map built, and I'll kind of build this out here. So this is my example, which again, I'm sure is missing many things for the people that actually build these apps for a living. You can see here that once they're all built out and you start moving things up and down by priority, again, talk about it. Talk about it with your team. If you increase the priority on pay with credit card over Apple Pay, explain to everyone why you're doing that and why you assume that that's a higher priority, right? Or if people want to challenge why something's a higher priority, this is a great time to do it. I guarantee you, if you go through this with your team, even 6 months later, everyone's going to remember more about why the work looks the way that it does than if you do the traditional sort of like, I worked by myself, I showed up to grooming, I sprung it on everybody, they kind of looked at it and then they built it, and then we get into problems. Like that's the typical failure mode I see, where well-meaning people do a lot of pre-work and they don't engage the team in enough of the actually coming up with the work, even at the planning phase. And then you get into issues down the line where maybe like something didn't come up you should have seen, or you paint yourself into a corner. Okay, so as you can see here, we've built out all the different tasks for this sort of example app. And then what you can do from here, once the priorities are set, is you can actually start building into release plans. So a quick note about release planning. Another common pitfall or sort of failure mode is you can be incrementally delivering, but it may not be usable every iteration, right? So I think this cartoon captures it very well, which is what we're trying to strive for is over on the left, right? At every iteration, you're delivering value to the user with each release. You can go farther and faster, but it's usable to the user at every phase, right? On the right, and we've all seen this happen for a litany of reasons. You might be incrementally delivering in chunks, but the thing's actually not really usable or delighting the user, or accomplishing the goal of getting from point A to point B for the user until 3 or 4 releases deep. And there's many reasons why this could happen, right? You could have internal pressures, maybe part of the technology is easier to start on, or part of the architecture is already ready for one part, so it makes more sense to start on something. But those are all, they're all valid reasons that can sort of cause you to change your planning approach. But if you don't keep an eye on sort of like, are we always delivering an end-to-end experience for the user, it's really easy to fall into the pitfall on the right. And user story maps are great because they, by their nature of being sort of visual, allow you to always maintain that left to right end-to-end view. And more than anything else, really on your first release, make sure that you're delivering on that end-to-end experience. I've seen many times where, for whatever reason, somebody really wants to over deliver and say, for example, they pulled in Apple Pay and credit card in this example into the checkout thing, but then they skipped out on actually being able to chat with support for some reason on the order, right? Like if you think about a complete experience for a user, like yeah, some number of people are probably not going to be thrilled that they can't use Apple Pay or whatever other method, but you want to make sure you have a complete experience that allows people to be able to check in on their actual order and get support if they need to. So if you're making that trade-off, I think most people on the phone would make the right choice there. But it's an example of how it's easy, especially when you're in a flat backlog tool, to say, oh, this is small, let's just pull it in, perhaps not mention or notice something else that's really important to the end-to-end experience. Whereas when you're looking at this type of map, it's really easy to see that up front. So what you'll do is you'll call out a release objective, right, with the team and say, okay, the release 1 is going to be basically somebody on an iOS app can make a complete order. That's the goal. So then everyone kind of works. You draw these lines, are called release lines or snap lines across the board. And effectively, you move the cards above the line that are going to have to be in that release to achieve that goal or for the objective that you set for the release. Now, I kind of ran out of room on this slide, so they're supposed to look more like this, which look a little bit nicer if you have more room on your board. Basically, you draw the lines straight across and you sort of move the actual stories or cards down into each release, and you can see the release contents. So in this way, it's doing a couple things. One, you're able to take a large complex feature or even just major product release that potentially crosses multiple different user personas, right? You're able to always see end to end, left to right, how the user is going to move through all these steps. You're always focused on the objective of each release and you know what you're going to get. And you can see visually, are you delivering something that actually provides incremental value and is end-to-end usable at each step? So it's a really versatile tool, even though it's not that complicated to get started. Obviously, like I said, there's lots of ways you can sort of build on this and make it more complicated as you get more adept at it. But just to get started and get your team talking and looking at these types of things, you're going to get like 80% of the benefit. All right, so a quick recap of what we've covered so far. So story maps are really going to get the entire team involved in planning and really reach that shared understanding we talked about. It's really critical that everyone remembers why we're doing what we're doing, why things are higher priority than they're not. They all feel engaged in the work and they feel like they understand it. And more importantly, 3 or 4 or 5 weeks down the road, they still believe and understand all that stuff. When you're looking at your flat backlog, it's actually gonna still tie together in your head and for other people because you have this other reference point that's not really a prototype, but it shows you the process map or the journey map effectively for how people are gonna move through this workflow. And when we get to the tools section later, good news, you know, jumping ahead, some of the tools we're going to show you actually have integrations to the major backlog uh, SaaS applications. So you can actually just do a story map and then integrate them straight in without having to recopy them. And then finally, you have multiple releases, right? So this allows you, once you've got all this work in the right order, the right priority, the end-to-end focus, to really break it out into multiple releases and make sure that each of those releases achieves an objective and delivers end-to-end value for the user. Okay, so now we're going to see if everyone can apply what we learned in the last couple of minutes here. So we've got 2 scenarios for everyone. You're going to be pre-assigned one of these scenarios. So what's going to happen is Michael is working feverishly in the background right now to assign everyone to Zoom breakout rooms. So you're basically, in a minute, you're going to see something pop up and we'll jump in. You're going to click a link in the chat and you're going to be assigned to one of these things based on your Zoom breakout room number. So kind of keep that in mind. The 2 topics are getting a prescription from the doctor and then picking it up at the local pharmacy. So if you think about building a user story map, and you guys are going to be using Jamboard, if you guys have seen or heard of that before, it's intentionally low tech and has something that looks like stickies, which is why we picked it. You're going to be trying to map out kind of an as is, like I said, as is current process for getting a prescription from the doctor and then going to pick it up. Like what's involved, what are the steps, what's the flow, etc. The second one is me more just being nostalgic for what life looked like 6 months ago and saying, let's book a trip and fly somewhere on like an airline website and basically go from booking the flight to getting to your seat on the plane. So what are the steps that have to happen to get to that? You're going to be in groups, I believe, of 6 to 7, so it's not going to be too unruly. We're going to want you guys to go through exactly what I talked about. So set up the backbone first, talk about it, reorder things, build out the steps or the stories, reprioritize them, etc. Talk about edge cases, and really take that snapshot of as is. Extra credit, if you guys finish quickly and you want to show off a little bit, feel free to start moving stuff around and talk about what an improved workflow might look like. But again, that's if you guys get there. Okay, so logistics. We're going, and there it is, Michael's ahead of me already. You just dropped in a link to an open public Google Doc into the group chat. So before you guys leave this group meeting and head off to your breakout rooms, make sure you click the link that he just posted to the chat right now, and that you can view it and you can get to it. And then when he hits go, you're going to see a pop-up for your breakout room. It's going to say breakout room number X. In the Google Sheet, you're going to want to click the link that's the same number as the breakout room that you have. So when you arrive, you're going to be using Zoom for audio and video with your workmates, but Jamboard is a cloud app, so you can all see each other without having to share your screen. So just, you can see each other working live in the Jamboard UI without having to share a screen. You guys are going to work, I believe, for 15 minutes. Michael, tell me if I'm right. It was 15 to 20. We will be broadcasting progress to all the chat rooms and kind of letting you guys know what timing looks like. And then we're going to bring everyone back, and we're going to pick someone to basically give an example of what they did in 2 of the sessions. We don't have a lot of time to go through a democratic process of picking people. So while you're working, pick amongst yourself the person who is most likely to want to speak publicly for your group should you be chosen. And then if your group gets picked, that person knows that they'll be the one talking through what you did. Okay? With that, I'm going to pause. We'll be kind of floating around the rooms to see if you guys need help, and we'll see you back in about 15 to 20. Good luck.
Yes, completely random. That would be 12 and 7.
All right, let's start with group 12. Did you guys pick a spokesperson? If so, that person can come off mute and talk through sort of what you did and what came up.
We did not pick a spokesperson because it closed in like 10 seconds. Happy to be it, unless anyone from 12, feel free to step up if you want to.
Go for it, Charlie. Hey, Michael, can you pull up their board? Is that possible?
Yes. We'll just need some music filler.
I'll talk a little bit at high level first. So one of the things that came up was, at what point does the story map start? So there was sort of, some initial steps in the pharmacy example where, some things are happening that may not require user interaction. So those are the things in green at the top. Where you're going to the doctor, you're getting a diagnosis, the doctor's deciding what medication, it's sending it to the pharmacy. Those are all things that happen potentially before you're interacting with the mobile app. So we represented them here, but there was this question of like, does it make sense to have those on there? Does get the app make sense to have it on there? Sort of where should it start is a question that came up. And then I think just a high level takeaway I saw was that doing it this way, having this process really helped illuminate some really good questions that are things that if we were really designing this mobile app would be things that we'd need to decide. So for example, contacting the pharmacy, is that something that's just in one place in the app, or is that something that's baked in throughout and it's a function that no matter where you are in the app is easy to do? And are you setting up your alerts sort of as a blanket for all prescriptions, so your alert settings are always the same, or is it such that when you are requesting a certain prescription that you're deciding which kinds of alerts you want? So these are the exact decisions that would come up and need to be decided if you were really building this. So I found that this tool was helpful for illuminating what those were and really getting everyone on the same page.
That's great. Thank you, guys. All right, our second lucky winners.
Group 7.
Do we have a spokesperson for Group 7?
We didn't nominate one, but I can go ahead unless anybody else wants to step in.
I think you just sufficiently nominated yourself. Thank you.
Okay. So like the previous presenter, we also face the challenge of what's the start and the end, and also had to make a decision about, are we talking about an app, are we talking about a website, are we talking about an aggregator, etc. So we centered on a website experience and defined between the ability to search for flights and the ability to select a seat, and then also kind of looked at what other steps might form part of the backbone as well. As the previous presenter was saying as well, many interesting conversations came up and questions came up, particularly with the prompting to sign in. And at what point does it make the most sense to ask somebody to log in and for their account details, and what's the benefit of being able to do that? So that was something interesting. Also, this is a very search-heavy type of story, so searching for flights between destinations. So there were, you can see that there were quite a few stories that kind of came out of that particular epic that are around what kind of search parameters, and then what do you need to do once you return a set of results and to select your seat. So in my opinion, it was more difficult to do than at first. It seems like, oh yeah, we've all booked flights before. This is something we all know how to do. But then when you get into it, it's definitely trickier.
Cool. So I'll throw him out into the sphere early. I don't know, Jeff, if you're floating around out there and you want to chime in at all, but I was going to say that certainly, like, there are some like ground rulings. These were intentionally vague, and you guys were able to struggle with them, on purpose. I think you could easily have interpreted these as being just normal, like no computers or apps involved, just like the steps I go to get to the store. Or you could completely, imagine as a mobile app, and both are completely relevant. Those are the kind of like basic ground rules you're going to want to actually have with your team when you get in there, obviously. But then, once you've kind of set those boundaries, you're going to want to step out of the way and let people kind of go crazy like you guys did. So given that you only received 15 to 20 minutes of instruction, I think it seems like people got the concept pretty well and started making good headway on it, which is great. I'm going to jump back into the slides and finish up with a couple thoughts here, and then we will open it up to Q&A. So 1 second here.
And Jeff's ready also, Chris, by the way.
Okay. I know he's raring to go. Let's see here. Everybody see that again? Okay, good. All right, so kind of wrapping up, now that everyone's had a chance to try it out, um, as you can tell, like I feel pretty passionate about this. I think this is a thing that's worth the investment, learning how to do this well. Like I said, this is just meant to sort of be a teaser intro to get you guys exposed to the concept, make it come to life a little bit. We're going to talk through additional resources to apply it in a minute. But if you get good at this, like at least in my team, my old company, the people that did this well really excelled at their role. And I could tell that the bond they had with their engineering teams and their designers was that much stronger because it really pulled everyone together. And obviously you guys know the tighter that connection is, the better everything's going to go for the team. And like I said, that shared understanding is really key. Like the map itself, the artifact that comes out is really cool and helpful. The activity of making the map is the magic part, right? Like that's where everybody gets aligned. That's where everything gets hashed out. As Charlie was saying, that's where all the good questions come up. And they're not going to come up unless you do something really interactive like this. You hand someone a spec or they all are staring at like a flat list of stuff in a grooming session, you're never going to get this kind of interaction or questions to come up. And the last part, like I said, is it doesn't have to be for like greenfield new features. You can really use this as a way to identify current state, like we were doing with things you do today, like going to the store or to the pharmacy or the airport. If you want a way to make your user research about what are people doing today before we start introducing a solution or that changes things, it's a great way to visualize current state of user behavior. Okay. So next up, a couple of tools here. First up is story mapping. So the good news is that people have actually figured out some online tools for this. So you don't actually have to be in a whiteboard with a room full of stickies if that's not possible for everyone now. These are a couple sample ones. So Cardboard and Avion are like basically purpose built for this activity, and they actually have integrations with some of the major backlog tracking tools like Jira, whatever that you would expect. So when I did this back in 2011 as a PM, somebody like drew the short straw and had to copy everything off the stickies into Jira that night. Now you can actually just do it in one step, and it's integrated, which is awesome. So you can kind of see what those UIs look like there. Jeff, I know, has been using Mural a lot. I'll let him talk about that if he wants to, or if he has any additional comments. Jeff, you want to chime in here at all?
Sorry, I had to unmute. No big preference. Somebody put in the chat Miro, and I hear a lot of good things about Miro, and yeah, I like Miro a lot. I like it better than Jamboard after using Jamboard a little bit. But yeah, there's starting to be a lot more tools out there. There's there's a plugin for Jira built specifically for this by a company called Easy Agile that I hear good things about as well. Not much more to add. Mural does a good job.
Okay, so we've gotten him out of hiding now. So one of the other resources is actually this book that this guy wrote, but really this is sort of the compendium of how to do this in a little bit more depth than we were able to cover tonight. So if you want to get some additional resource and understand fully sort of how to apply this, he talked through some of the more advanced use cases around multiple personas, and then actually how you take this work and then translate it down into bite-sized chunks that an engineering team can take and really run with. That's all captured in the book. So good resource for everyone as well. Okay, so with that, we're going to hand it over to everybody on the phone for Q&A. I'm probably going to warn Jeff that I'm going to let him answer a lot of these because that's kind of the point of him being here, and I'm not the expert, but I'll help out where I can. All right, guys.
Chris, that's not true. Look, I just teach this stuff. It's been a while since I've been a real product manager doing the work for real. I trust your opinion and your experience. So anyway, I might.
You're just gonna see us like shirk responsibility back and forth. So ask a question.
Yeah.
And is everyone familiar with the raise hand feature in Zoom? I just want to keep the Q&A a bit orderly so not everyone's talking over one another. So I would encourage you, if you have a question, to raise your hand, and then I'll call on you, and then you can unmute if that works for folks. So first question, Roger, I see that you have a question.
Yes. Oh, sorry, things got really loud outside. My team currently has a situation where we would really like to see compare the as is and the to be sort of versions of the board? And is there a representation for that that makes it really easy to visualize, oh, this is what's going to be different for the end user in their workflow?
No. I do see people build as is and to be boards an awful lot. And I see them build an as is board and then advance to a to be board. Chris kind of described that kind of move also, mapping the current state. And then what I see an awful lot is evolving the current state to, once you map the current state. And one thing to add in that I'll ask people to add into story maps is where the pain is. If you map the current state, where's the suck? Mark the pains, mark the rewards. You can use a story map and look at things like frequency and duration. For instance, how long does it take to get from here to here in the map? And once you start talking about what's going on in the map, people start automatically thinking of ways to fix it. And I see people start to mutate or change the map from an as-is to a to-be board. Now I do see people building an as-is board and then immediately underneath it building a to-be board. And there is a variation of a map from a lady named Indy Young called a mental model. And in her mental model, it's more of a research tool in that the top half of the map describes what users are doing and thinking and feeling, and the bottom half of the map describes functionality. You know how the story map you built kind of looks like it's a backbone with things hanging down? Indy's maps kind of look like a cityscape with a cityscape reflected in the water, where there's towers going up and towers going down. I almost wonder if you could build an as-is on the top and a to-be on the bottom that way, but play with it. There's no hard and fast rules for the way this has to work. Long answer.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Dan Gonzalez, I see your hand raised. We'll call on you next.
Sure. So, all of this makes sense, and thank you for presenting. I guess my question is more around getting engineering buy-in. I've definitely worked with a lot of engineers who would much rather be writing code than, sitting in a lot of meetings to produce one of these.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question, right? I think a lot of that obviously falls on the PM to sort of like communicate why this is important. I mean, I think we've all seen the failure mode of the, we need to get going. Where are we going? Well, I don't know, but we need to start going there, right? It's this notion of like, we don't have enough time to plan, but we need to get started, but we don't know what we're doing. I think trying to make that case to your developers to say, look, guys, when have we gotten into these situations where there's rework, right? Or we got ourselves painted into a corner, or we got into a sprint and realized the scope was 3 times the size. I know developers don't necessarily like to be in lots of planning meetings. They really don't like that when the thing that they committed to for the week is suddenly blowing up in their face because maybe we didn't quite understand it the right way. So, I think there's a little bit of maybe, pain aversion that you can throw in there to be like, look, these are the downstream failure modes that are going to cost us more that we avoid by doing this, right? And really show the benefits. It depends on your team too. Like I've had some developers that like, they want to be involved, right? Like they really want more interaction and want to be able to really help craft the thing that they're building, not just be like handed a stack of stories and say, make this. So depending on like which personality type you're kind of going with, I think it's, it's always important to plan and make sure you know where you're going. And this is probably one of the better tools for doing that. But at the same time, if it's the kind of person that would really wants to be more involved in the thing and have ownership in what they're building, it's a great way to engage them that way as well. My sense is that just like, I don't know, we didn't do a poll on the call here. We didn't try all the Zoom features tonight, but like how many people had actually seen this before tonight, or if you kind of like maybe heard about it, but you hadn't used it before. My guess is if it's like less than half for PMs, that wouldn't be surprising to me. Like, actually having applied it versus heard about it. Engineers, it's going to be less, right? So I think however you can, like showing them this new method. It's like, it's not another grooming meeting where I'm talking the whole time and everyone's listening to me talk for an hour about stuff they've never seen before. Because if that's what's in their mind, I can see why they're going to tune out. This is like, no, we're all talking together about creating something together. Maybe that helps. Jeff, if you've got an idea there.
Just build on what you said. My general rule of thumb is that they don't want to be there. Attendance is optional. Let them self-select. it sucks trying to collaborate with people who aren't interested in being there and aren't interested in collaborating. They not only are they not valuable, they slow things down for the people who are trying to work together. Let attendance be optional. And like Chris was saying, there are engineers that do care about this stuff. And one of the things I see happen is once an engineer or two do participate and they understand, they start becoming the go-to person for everyone else who doesn't understand, and it causes more engineers to want to participate.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Next up, Shaju Shekhar. I see your hand raised.
Yeah. So my question is more on the lines of the release, and then if you connect it with the MVP, if you were to set up a guideline, right? This has to go. I'm launching the product for the first time, and this is something that is going to go out in the market, right? And if you were to suggest that this is what the guidelines is going to be, what we are going to launch in terms of features, and if you can connect it with the backbone and the steps a little bit, that would be very helpful.
Just want to make sure I understand the question. So you're asking, like, is there a hard and fast rule for sort of identifying MVP? Is that where you're going?
Yeah. So what is your suggestion of what can go in an MVP? When you're launching the product the first time, and how would you connect it with?
Jeff's already laughing because this is like the 4-hour answer question that's never answerable. It depends. I think more than anything else, the thing that really matters is like that little cartoon drawing, right? It's as long as the first release is actually usable, and by usable, I don't mean like part of it actually does the thing it's supposed to do, but the whole thing's not done yet. It's really about making sure that the user can get through a complete experience end to end, and then whatever that is, that's probably your MVP, right? Like it's going to vary widely depending on what you're up to and what's acceptable in your market and the competition, all that kind of stuff. But even if you're coming to market late with something where there's a bajillion other people doing the same thing already, trying to overperform and stuff a bunch of stuff in the early phase, like I said in the example, and then like missing out on some really critical stuff that really makes it end to end is probably going to end up hurting you more and burning out all your initial users and messing up your reviews, than taking the pain and really focusing on something that allows people to kind of like actually get through the whole workflow. Jeff, you want to wade into those waters?
If you want to hear me ramble about what MVP used to mean and what it means now, if you Google just my name,
2-minute version.
Yeah, there's a talk out there, but MVP used to mean smallest successful product. In Lean Startup, it got defined as something that's more of a test. One concept that I will hit people with is, are we releasing to learn or releasing to earn? That illustration that Chris used in the presentation is specifically in a chapter that talks about releasing to learn. And if you'll notice when it's that skateboard to sports car metaphor, you notice that the release of the skateboard resulted in somebody that was unhappy. It's okay to release less than perfect stuff to a small audience, to early adopters. And that's a good place to release an MVP to. It has to be functionally complete, but early adopters will use things and they're excited to be first. They're excited to help evolve the thing. So you can release just enough to be usable to early adopters, but if you're trying to make a splash in the market and it's going to get reviewed by people and things like that, don't release the skateboard. Don't release just enough. And most successful companies follow a kind of a release to learn progression. Release to learn that eventually edges into a release to earn sort of thing. They'll release to small markets or small groups. Chris, did you guys do this with Carbonite a bit or a lot?
Yeah, I mean, it depended, right? So we were kind of a mix, right? Because we did a lot of acquisitions. So there was a lot of integration projects we did, as well as a lot of organic. So it depended on which one you're talking about. So yeah, I mean, there's examples of both. I think because we were more of a large established company, we did a lot more of the testing to learn piece because we were testing like a feature than like a whole thing. Typically, if we did a launch into our space, it was more of the launch to earn type thing.
Yeah, once you get a product on the market, releases now mean are small and frequent. They're new features. They're new features, new capabilities, things like that. I'm not, Kamal, I'm not sure if that helps or not, but.
Excellent. Well, just in the interest of time, Jason Breen, I see your hand up. Feel free to unmute and ask a question.
Yeah, thanks for your guys' time. My question is based off the question Charlie asked earlier, which is, what are some best practices around what the first epic and the last epic should be when you are creating a user story? When we were doing even the plain example, and it was similar to the consensus that we do this all the time. We know what's going on, and then there was still some friction around what the last epic should be. I'm wondering if you have some best practices or recommendations around that.
You said best practice. That's you, Jeff.
For me, I'll draw a distinction between stories and storytelling and building shared understanding and backlog items. So I like mapping I like mapping the user's journey long before it touches the software, and I don't care if it's afterwards, because everything I put on the top isn't an epic that goes into Jira. It only is when I decide it is, when I decide it's work to do. So don't worry about it. Map the things before, but then what you're deciding when you put things into the map is this a backlog item or not a backlog item? Is this work or we throw a ton of options into story maps, things that we could do, things that would make it better, things that are interesting. And I like having a lot more options that I can cut away or filter away. So if I rewind, yes, put things in the backbone of the map that aren't necessarily software to build. That's okay, but don't create tickets in Jira for them. Does that get at the question a little bit for you?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. Yeah, kind of it speaks to the point of you can always eliminate things afterwards by not adding them to a Jira ticket, but you can still be mindful they're occurring in the user experience.
Right. So one of the things, for instance, if you use a tool like Mural, you can spray a whole bunch of stuff all over the board, create a super chaotic map, and then say, okay, this chunk of tickets is my first release, select that chunk of tickets and push that to Mural. You don't have to push everything you created into it, but use the mapping as a way to make decisions and see the big picture.
Excellent. Rudolph, I see your hands raised. We'll go to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for that answer. I was also in Jason's team earlier, and it's like defining the really high level epic, looking at the story that the person actually takes the seat. But my question is around in the user mapping and the release. So I'm so lucky enough that I've been working in a number of software companies over the last 15 years, and we've been using story mapping as we saw today. But often we now have the teams giving their views as to what the release slices would be. So, you define your MVP, which we rarely use the term. We prefer using minimum usable product, because the whole story mapping is a usable journey at the end here. But once you get to the second releases, sometimes we decide not to have the entire map slice. For example, in Chris, in your presentation, you have the first MVP excluding the Android and stuff. So Jeff or Chris, what's your view in terms of having the second release slice starting from, say, the second epic? Or maybe the second release is entirely the next important item in the first epic, i.e. Android, for example, support an Android in the example earlier. So it tends to be a big chunk. So in terms of second release, is there a hard, fast rule in terms of it has to be an end-to-end slice of the map, or we can have just an item?
I think.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I sense from Jeff, and you'll notice this pattern in his answers. There are very few hard and fast rules, but I think, like, even in the more pretty example, the second one with the straight lines, if I kind of understand where you're going, like that one showed like not every backbone item had sort of something represented in the second release, and that's fine, right? Like it might be the case that you're building on what you built in the first release, and to have a complete experience around Apple Pay, you actually need to do something different early on and something different in support. So those 3 columns get picked up, but that's it. And that's all you need to do to add that end-to-end experience to that one thing, and it builds on the rest. So I don't think there's necessarily like a hard and fast rule. Of course, Jeff's going to correct me and say I'm wrong, but like, I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about where you start and where you don't. And I would honestly say, like, resist temptation for the second release to be this giant thing that's as big as the first release. That almost never goes well. You know, unless you really have like tons of business pressure. I think like get an MVP out there, build on it iteratively, and then yeah, like you're going to get to that point where you need to add that next big step. But I think that one of the big failure modes you always see is the hit and run, right? Like, okay, we got this release out, now let's run on to the next project and forget that that thing ever existed, right? And you know, lots of nodding. The story map kind of makes like holds yourself accountable to, like, we said we were going to do all this stuff to build the experience to be the car, and you can see that every day when you come in. So it kind of forces you to like finish what you started. And like I said before, like you really want to make sure you're solving like a high percentage of the needs for one user before you move on to the next one or the next use case, rather than solving like everything 10% and never really doing anything very well. And I think those are some of the pitfalls. And Jeff, you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, yes, by everything you say, and absolutely no hard and fast rules. If you've got a mature product, you'll find that you rarely end up mapping the whole product. You map the capability you're about to add to that product, and you tell a story that starts at the beginning of the use of the capability and ends at the end of the use of that capability or feature. So you know, I'll tell people more and more these days that look, you can map anything. Just decide what your product is or what your feature capability is, who your users are, and a beginning and an end to the story, and you can map it. That's it. So yeah, just map the feature. That's okay. But you know, one other thing to add is when I'm mapping, one of my slicing mechanisms isn't MVP or first release. I'll do good, better, best slicing. What's good enough for the first release? What's a better release? What's a best release? And always plan on, look, if good enough works, then we can stop there. If good enough isn't good enough, then we can move on to better or best. And so I'll always have lots of end-to-end-ish slices, things that build it up or make it go from good to better.
Great. Elvin, I see that your hand's raised.
Sure, thank you. I'm trying to understand the goal or the scope of the user story mapping, meaning should it just really like tell like kind of like a user story? Is that the goal of it, or should it eventually evolve into more like an implementation planning with, let's say, user stories describing data architecture or I don't know, like, you know, become like more detailed? I'm thinking like, especially because we are involving engineers, oftentimes engineers will start asking, wait, what does that mean? We don't have this data structure. We don't support this. What does that mean? So is that out of scope and for later, or should it be part of user story mapping?
I'll give my opinion only because that's one of my favorite topics. You know, I think there's probably a whole other 2-hour talk on, you know, are you strictly adhering to doing like user stories with development tasks underneath them, and do you have architecture stories? Like there's hours of conversation to be had around all that stuff. So without like jumping into like what's good and bad about those different things, I think what you just said is the important part, right? Like they're gonna have questions. As long as that's getting captured somewhere, how you actually end up documenting it doesn't really matter. But like by involving them, like for example, in the example I did, I actually forgot to bring up when I was talking, but like one of the stories is like view the menu of the restaurant. Well, there should be a whole other map for like how the restaurant actually inputs their menu and their price list and all that stuff. And it's nowhere on that map. Now, obviously, whoever owned that app should have theoretically thought about that already, but that's an example of the kind of thing that, like, as you're going through it with the devs, they're going to be like, well, wait a minute, where's all this stuff coming from? Like, who's getting all this information? What format does that need to be in? So, you know, I think it's healthy and it's good. Like, I'm not going to give you a hard and fast answer, although you can probably guess my preference on hardcore like architecture and development stories versus them being always tied to something of user-facing value. Hint, hint. But as long as it's being captured and recorded somewhere in the exercise, I think you're gonna avoid the pitfall. Jeff?
Agree. Sometimes things are implementation details or design decisions that get captured in the details of a card or a chunk. One other thing to add, though, everything doesn't need to be a user story. I've worked with organizations building stock trading apps, and it starts with a trader choosing a trading strategy and starting to execute the trade strategy. And that's execute this trade strategy is one button click, but then the system picks up and it does a bunch of really complicated things. Anthropomorphize the system, and I'll tell people story maps are built out of short verb phrases. They're built out of tasks or steps that users perform. But if you're mapping the system, they're built out of steps the system performs too. So it's okay to have runs of the map that describe complex stuff the system does too. Ideally, in stories, you're building something demonstrable, with every story. So you don't have a story about creating a database structure, ideally. Because that's not really viewable and demonstrable. But yeah, a lot of people do it different ways, and people make that work too.
Great. Nick Duran, your hand's up.
Yeah, just as I'm sure this could be a segue into future episodes of good talks, but storytelling is extremely important for me when I'm engaging my audiences, people that may or may not be connected daily with your product. What are some of the buzzwords and key things that sit around this story mapping process that, as I go click and buy this wonderful book that's referenced, that we should also be looking at to help engage and elaborate more on this kind of work? I love choosing colors and telling stories and making sure people are convinced, but that's part of my manipulation of my audience. So what am I wrapping this story mapping with?
Oh, I guess that's probably mine to answer. Chris, you got any?
You can start.
Nick, I want to make sure I'm under. It was Nick, right? Want to make sure I'm understanding your question. Oh gosh, I think her name is Barbara Lickshaw, that wrote another book with the title of Story Mapping. And she has every talk she has to start and say, it's not that Jeff Patton story mapping, it's this other kind. And she talks about the narrative and more of the compelling story, the hero's journey, and what story maps that we build for software tend to be kind of overloaded. They're not about one user's journey through the product. They're a mashup of all users' possible journeys through a product. They're more about a map of a product and less about a map of one individual user's journey. So if you've got a story map, you can use those story maps to spin scenarios. And Barbara's book talks a little bit about that. And if you look at mapping in general, it's another O'Reilly book on mapping experience that talks about a bazillion different kind of map forms. People that do service design, also mapping is a core part of service design, where we're designing things that happen in the real world as well as things that touch on to technology products. Journey map is a common term used for that kind of mapping. And the one thing I remind people of, I thought for a brief moment that I invented or I coined the term story map. Because I came up with it in a conversation with a friend trying to describe this mapping thing that I was doing. And I said, it's just a map of stories. And he said, why don't you call it that? And I said, oh, great, I will. That's perfect. And I thought I invented it. But if you look up, somebody pointed out to me years later that I did not. If you go to Amazon, you type in story map and hit return, the first books you're going to see are books on screenplay writing. It's an old term. It's been used, story maps have been used to write screenplays and novels and things like that for years. It's a writer's tool. It is a storytelling tool. Nick, does that wrap some stuff around your question?
Absolutely. Thank you for the response. I appreciate part of my challenge is not getting wrapped around the axle. Degree in anthropology, cohesion and coupling are very, very fond topics in my brain. So thank you for the simplification. Appreciate it.
No worries.
Yeah, so completely funny segue. We have one more, Michael, or are we at time?
Yeah, well, one that came through the chat. They said, huge fan of involving the team for the benefit of alignment. But regarding story mapping, how do you navigate the dangers of people participating in that process that aren't necessarily deeply connected to the customer need and experience?
So it's one of those, I think you answered it yourself things. So part of it is like, if you never start, they're never gonna get that exposure, right? So like Jeff said, if there's people that don't want to be there, then it's fine to not have them be there because they're not going to necessarily help the activity. But if you have someone who's willing and wants to be there, and they just, those PMs are never over controlling, right? That's not something that anyone would ever describe us as. But they want to make sure that everyone there is going to be able to contribute and they have enough knowledge to do it. I think you'd be surprised, but I think it's also a great opportunity for you to teach your team. So like if someone starts moving things around or asking questions or putting cards on, rather than using it as a way to sort of like confirm your worst fears that maybe people didn't know enough to sort of participate, like use that as a teaching moment, right? And really say like, look, that makes sense, but actually these kind of people go about this thing this way. And it makes more sense to do this before we do this. And then you'll get your team there, right? Like engineers are still going to be engineers 99% of their time, right? I think if you do this activity enough, they're going to pick up a lot more intrinsic knowledge about your customer base and your users and how they think than you would if you just like, again, go to some grooming meeting once a week and they look at a list of stuff and you kind of figure out the story points and they go back to what they were doing. Like they're not going to learn anything from that. This type of activity and the conversation that comes from it, it's not going to be the first meeting. The first meeting is going to be very painful. But over time, they're going to develop that shorthand and they'll learn.
Just to build on that, I spend a lot of time explaining to people that stories get their name not from how you write them, but how you use them. Stories are about storytelling and building shared understanding. And there's never enough written on those sticky notes to actually tell a story. And what Chris just described is how you use those as teaching moments, or you use those as ways to actually tell your users stories. It supports that well.
Great. And then one more question that came through the chat is, how do you manage multiple critical backbones?
As one person, I'd suggest hiring people. It's tough, right? I think if the person can clarify in the chat, is it just a matter of like, if you own multiple product lines, or like if you have multiple workflows within an existing product, like what exactly were you asking about?
Looks like that person actually dropped off.
Okay.
So it looks like, Raju, your hand's raised. We'll move on to your question.
Hi. I have a question talking about this user story mapping is pretty good in detail for a software level product development. But if there is a product enterprise scale, I know in the agile world, there is a scaled agile. So what is the best way to approach the enterprise scale?
I think Jeff's had some pretty large clients. I don't know if you want to talk about applications here.
It's worth saying that the largest adopter of story mapping is SAP. Does that count as enterprise scale?
Yeah, sure. No, what is the best standard or best way to approach that? Is that the same as different levels of user story mapping, or are there any other standard practices in place? That's why
one thing to story maps are fairly user centric. What you're mapping is a user's experience in a product, the steps that users take. So regardless of how big the product is or how enterprisey it is, it'll eventually evolve into user steps. Now that said, an enterprise product with lots of different users and lots of different functionality is lots of maps and lots of mapping. If you go up an abstraction level, you're no longer at a map that describes a user's experience. You've got a map that describes modules. You've got architecture diagrams and things like that. Raju, is that what you're talking about? Is looking at things at a higher level and understanding the composition of the whole system?
Yeah, that is one part of it. The other aspect to add to it is if you have kind of a product, I think earlier somehow come up like you're placing an order behind the scenes, there is an operations team or a marketing team. So how do you bring all these pieces together? I know in Agile world, they have Agile marketing and all those aspects. In the concept of product management, how is that going to be represented? So that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, it may not be a story map as a best tool. If a story map gets used to think through product experience outside in, from a user's perspective in, it's kind of a dual use tool in that you start by thinking of a product from the user's experience in, and then it morphs into a bit of a planning tool to allow us to decide what functionality to build when, but it's a planning tool for that experience. but it's not the tool. I don't know if I would use it as the tool to plan a marketing campaign or to plan an operational rollout, or to plan a conversion, things like that. Yeah.
The one positive though that I'll throw in as a counter though is like, it's one because like the whole point of the beginning of the talk where I said there's like this missing piece. Like, it's really hard to show anybody not in engineering or product Jira and explain what's coming, right? Like any other function in the company is going to look at you like you have 6 heads, right? So what you need to do is have some sort of visual way to show what's coming and what's coming over the releases. So you could use the story map sort of like, it's not going to be your marketing release plan, but your product marketing person should be able to sort of grok like what's going on, see how it's going to feather out over multiple releases, and develop their plan from that insight, which depending on like, it's going to be difficult for people to get that dropping in at the end of a process and jumping into like Jira and looking at a list of 45 stories and trying to figure out what is this thing. Whereas if you engage them in the planning process or show them the map and talk them through it, whether they're operations or support or anybody else, that everyone can kind of center around what's the user experience, what's the user value we're delivering in each release. So it's not going to be your release plan, but it'll be a way for you to communicate why they should care at every phase.
Okay. Now, I know from a technical perspective, obviously it's not in the release plan, but in order to make the product available to a customer, you still need the operations or other aspects of the product, right? So,
yep.
Yeah, I think it might be a different kind of planning, but one rule of thumb that I'll always go back to is, boy, if you can visualize it spatially, things go better. Just documents and spreadsheets or lists of backlog items are just kind of crippled. They don't allow you to see relationships between things quite as well. Invent your own maps.
Okay, that's good. That's fine. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Raju. And Lenny Mullen, I see your hand raised.
Hey guys. So it's interesting. I've done a bit of story mapping, not necessarily leading the session, but participating in it. And we've kind of run into it's we're working with a team right now. It's an operations group that has a lot of kind of convoluted and intertwined and kind of we don't even really know yet. It's very discovery based, right? So like we're still trying to figure out like what's repeatable, like what are we actually doing, like, and what I've found is the group overall, like it's a solid group. They know what they're talking about, but they tend to get kind of lost in the weeds, and it's really challenging kind of defining that backbone and figuring out how we shape this thing that we're doing into something that's repeatable. And I guess if you're working with a group, just for anybody, if you're working with a group that maybe struggles with like trying to put together a larger vision, what would be kind of your recommendations for how to go about talking with that group?
I would say, like what comes up first, I think, is like in those situations, especially where you tend to like accidentally dip in the weeds every 5 seconds, is that more or less one of the things you're bumping into?
It'd be nice if we could go for 5 seconds.
Okay. So I think that's where like literally doing things like writing the goal you're trying to achieve on the board and sort of always like pointing back to that is one technique. And you don't have to be passive aggressive about it, but you can be playful and reminding people that like, hey, like we're trying to get to this, what are the high level steps, and then have to get to this, right? And kind of bring everyone back to that core. It probably requires a lot more active management to like keep people at the right level of detail, and setting those ground rules up front. Like, guys, we're not going into technical implementation today. We're just capturing it. So figure out where it is, write it down, move on, right? And try and like stop it before it gets going too crazy. But it's tough in some crowds. Jeff, do you have any wisdom on this one?
A couple other things. Lenny, you said it was an operations team. What they're
sorry, guys.
What they might be mapping is their work, correct? The things that they perform as part of operations. So what they're mapping are the short verb phrases that are about the jobs that they do for people. This starts to be what service mapping actually looks like if you were doing service design. The best way to find the backbone is just I find a lot of the structure emerges bottom up. If you write everything down that we do, start to pile things by things that are similar to each other, things naturally start to organize themselves chronologically, things that happen early and things that happen late. And anything can happen in any order a lot of times in a map. I've worked with game companies. I've worked with King, and I've mapped Candy Crush before, and anything can happen in any order in games, but there's certain natural speaking order to it. Let the things clump and then add the backbones item on the top. They'll emerge to distill what's going on below it. I don't know if that helps. But one other thing I'll mention in the context of just facilitating groups, one of the things we used to do, completely unrelated to story mapping, is we used to create these signs that were on the table. We printed them as signs, or sometimes we wrote them on paper cups. We had a sign that said sold, a sign that said tangent, and a sign that said too much detail. So if people started rambling on about something, somebody could pick up the sold sign. I get it. Let's move on. Or the tangent sign is, like to Chris's point, we're not talking about the goal that we're working on anymore. Or the too much detail sign is the you've gone off in the weeds. I was about to step away from my desk. I've got examples of the signs somewhere in my office. It'd take me too long to find them. But yeah. Those are useful, but those are, we used to call those pacekeeping signals. They're just to help keep pace during a meeting. And people try not to be rude. They try not to interrupt each other, but holding up a sign is something quiet that people can do. And it's fun when it's done well.
Yeah, that's great. Good advice, thank you.
Excellent. Well, I know we're 8 minutes past 7:30 here on Eastern time. I want to thank Jeff and Chris for their time, and everyone who joined for joining. Thanks for bearing with us as we navigated the Breakout and Jamboard situation together. Needless to say, we put a user story map for this event beforehand. Thank you. We'll send the recording out. You do have an event survey feedback, the link to the Director of Diversity and Inclusion opportunity, as well as sign up for September's event in that email. So I'd appreciate if you could open that up and look at those things. Thank you very much again, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jeff, for coming as well.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks, all.